Welcome, Sidak Atnakistan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tisu Stas, Landak Nalchin. So, hello everybody, I'm Stephanie Carroll. On behalf of the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, the Indigenous Data Exchange, the Indigelab Network, and Indigenous Data Law Lab at NYU, and the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges and Science, welcome. I'm joining you from the homelands of the O'odham, also currently home to the Yaqui peoples in Tucson or Tucson, Arizona. The world's first Indigenous data standard, IEEE 2890-2025 Recommended Practice for the Provenance of Indigenous Peoples Data webinar, is supported by the United States National Science Foundation funded Indigenous Data Exchange. The Indigenous Data Exchange leverages and supports existing Indigenous data sovereignty and governance networks' ongoing efforts to advance policy and practice and create and share tools for the governance of Indigenous data. Janan, thank you for joining us. Each of our presenters and discussants today will introduce themselves prior to speaking. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. At this point, I'm going to hand over to my dear friend and colleague, Jane Anderson, to begin with our contact.
Thanks, Steph. Hi, everybody. My name's Jane Anderson. I'm calling in from Lenape-Hoking, or the lands of the Lenape Nations, forcibly removed from New York and residing in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Ontario, Canada. I am the founder of Local Contexts and also the director of the new Indigenous Data Law Lab at NYU. And we're delighted to be able to share both the kind of making of this provenance standard as well as kind of what its provisions include. Next slide, Riley. So we do want to start with a little bit of a shout out to our colleagues, Warinari Flores and Sierra Hicks, who have done an amazing podcast on decoding the IEEE standard. It's on their podcast, Relational Science, and we have a QR code at the end of this presentation, so you can hear that. They have a part one and a part two. And, you know, this quote from the podcast really stands out in terms of kind of what this work has been about. It's been a long time coming. It's taken a lot of effort. But really, you know, this kind of key quote that the standard walks Indigenous data sovereignty back to the fundamental idea that Indigenous people are connected to their data. It might seem rudimentary to many, but it's actually quite radical. It's a gigantic step forward for the movement. So again, huge shout out for that podcast that really goes in deep in relationship to what the standard involves and includes. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Steph.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to give a very brief background, kind of grounding us in Indigenous data before Jane kind of discusses where we came from in terms of creating this provenance standard. Next slide, please. So we begin with the story, essentially, that Indigenous peoples have always been data experts and have used various instruments and methods to collect, store, and share their data. On the top here, we see Pahu Manamana o Umi, a giant vertical rock structure and stellar instrument that sits atop Mauna Loa in Hawaii. On the bottom left, Marshallese stick chart, which is really a map of ocean swells and islands used to share voyaging knowledge. And in the bottom right, Lakota winter count, a pictorial calendar used to remember events, retell stories, and track time. These are just a handful of the various methods that we've had in our communities since time immemorial. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about Indigenous data, we're really thinking through and being inclusive of Indigenous perspectives of our relationships to the lands, waters, cosmos, and so forth. So Indigenous data are information and knowledges in any format that impact Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and the individual level. So we're talking about data about our non-human relations. This is, again, land or water, sacred ecosystems, animals, and so forth. Data about us is individuals. This could be administrative, legal data, health data, corporate data, commercial data, service-oriented data, and then data about us as collectives, our traditional and cultural information, our languages, our knowledge systems, ancestral and clan knowledges, and so forth. What we really see here is this very expansive view of our relations as Indigenous people, and our relation to them as data that we need to be in service to and to be have persistent connection to. Um, this definition is definitely one of the most difficult things that broader audiences have because usually there's an inclination to pare down data to specific binary zeros and ones or digital information. But in the real lived world, data is everything that we experience. Next slide, please. We position this work that we're doing with understanding that we are overcoming structural racism and we are overcoming colonization through our data relations. Sovereignty matters. It is at heart in terms of what we are talking about in provenance and having the connection back to and the ability to enact protocols and permissions around our data. Today, the settler colonial project continues. While previous experiences in colonization across the globe, everything from the taking of our children, the taking of our land, the taking of our data, has caused inequities for us. We know this persists today. But nevertheless, Indigenous peoples survive, thrive, and persist. We are still here. And our self-determination and governance lead to vibrant communities for us. And data is just a part, but a very important part of our relations on our healing journey. Next slide. So, what is Indigenous data sovereignty? In a nutshell, it's the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. So, it derives from the inherent right to govern peoples, lands, and resources. Importantly, it has its genesis in the traditions, roles, and responsibilities for the use of community-held information. Knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as people. And it is positioned within a human rights framework, planetary rights framework, and so forth, to leverage things like court cases, treaties, recognition, and so forth, but not dependent on those. 2 points of how Indigenous aspiration and design around Indigenous data sovereignty has pushed forward through mainstream conceptions of data sovereignty. Geographic jurisdiction is one of the most important pieces and tenets of mainstream data sovereignty. Indigenous peoples are arguing for and asserting their rights and their responsibilities about having persistent relationships with their data wherever it may be. And so that is important to this discussion that we're having today about provenance. Next slide. Um, Indigenous data sovereignty is the right, and Indigenous peoples engage in governance actions around data in two really important ways that interact with each other. One is the governance of data, which is enacting roles, responsibilities, protocols, laws, policies, and such that align with community values to build data and to build data systems and to actually enact those traditions and roles and responsibilities that we've had in our communities for community held information since time immemorial. And that leads us into data for governance. We need data to reach our own aspirations, to build our own worlds. And so when we govern data, we can reclaim data that has been taken from us and then it may sit somewhere else. And we can also build our own data and data systems at the same time. Next slide, please. Touching on the CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and the complementary, by design, FAIR principles of data being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Right now, the vast majority of data is neither FAIR nor CARE. And we're working through the process of trying to identify the ways that we set up protocols and policies for the collection of new data, but how do we rectify systems of legacy data to bring them up to a place where we can have them under self-determination of the communities and the peoples to whom they relate, and to be beneficial to those communities as well. Next slide, please. So, how did we get to provenance as the first standard? Um, I will say that there was a lot of work, and Jane is going to talk about that right now. But always there's a story about conversations, and always there's a story about sometimes you just meet the right people at the right time, who can catapult an effort forward. So, over to you, Jane.
Great, thanks, Steph. And again, just kind of so much of this work is comes from previous work, like the creation of Indigenous data sovereignty as a movement, which is both temporal in the sense that it's looking backwards at some of the legacy challenges, but also looking forward into like what can data mean and how can data become a tool for Indigenous governance, and kind of what does that look like. So, even kind of asking the question, like, why a standard, not another legal framework? Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, we're very unlikely to see a legal framework that supports Indigenous data sovereignty. So we were really interested in what are the kind of other strategies that we could use that establish different kinds of expectations and practices that support Indigenous peoples' data. And provenance was really that kind of key first piece that we saw as something that was necessary and would actually go a long way for this work. So next slide, Riley. So I'm going to start just a little bit from where I stand. I'm the founder of Local Contexts, which was an organization, or is an organization that is a 501c3. It's a not-for-profit organization. It really started in 2010, dealing with the challenges that of impoverished metadata, of the lack of Indigenous names and community relationships that are in archives, libraries, and museums around the world, and then, of course, moving into science spaces where enormous amounts of data are being collected, but Indigenous provenance information is not included. And next slide, Riley, as part of that project, we developed traditional knowledge and biocultural labels, which are specifically for Indigenous communities to add cultural authority back into the record, as well as specific tools for researchers and institutions to really disclose the existence of Indigenous data that sits within these spaces. You can't govern Indigenous data if you don't know where Indigenous data is. And so these are kind of key interventions that kind of seek to actually provide tools and frameworks that support reconnection back to Indigenous data. Next slide, Riley. So the traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels really already had a provenance piece to them. We kind of divide them in three categories: the provenance labels, which is where does this information come from? Where does this data come from? Who is it connected to? What are the relations that kind of will always already sit with that data? We have protocol labels that kind of speak more to kind of what are the rules and responsibilities that sit around the data. And then we have permission labels, different kinds of consent and permissions that will also sit around the data. So we already kind of had these categories, and often seeing that provenance or attribution and connection was really the first thing that communities wanted to make sure was in the record. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we started with provenance. Next slide, Riley. So just in terms of kind of where we are for local context and kind of what, as a particular kind of digital intervention that is really intervening within colonial infrastructures, this is kind of where we're at, having built kind of technology that has never been built before to actually make sure that Indigenous authority is embedded and also part of how the labels are developed, to the different kinds of connection that we make possible between institutions and researchers that actually hold and have been collecting Indigenous data and actually need to make those firmer relations clearer back to Indigenous communities. Next slide, Riley. And this is just kind of an example of the problem that we were dealing with. This is kind of some of the work that we've been doing with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which has over 3 billion occurrence records from 1592 to 2025. This is kind of what it kind of looks like colonialism, right? The collection of data from Indigenous lands and waters. This is a slide that has been developed in the collaboration with GBIF by Erin Robinson. And we'll just go to the next slide now, Riley. And this slide actually, so previously there was no way of finding Indigenous data. There were no metadata fields. There was no information about Indigenous lands and waters. There was no information about Indigenous communities. Those fields just didn't exist. And so the work that we've been doing with GBIF at the moment is to actually surface that data to make that visible and to connect communities back to it. So it's not so much that we now have 2 million occurrence records that have local context metadata associated with it, but within the kind of scheme where from 3 billion to where there's no information to 2 million, where we're starting to get more connection happening. This kind of demonstrates how important provenance information is with the data and what it means to have fields that can include that provenance information in the kind of metadata schemas themselves. Next slide, Riley. So we initiated the standard in 2020, and so it has been 5 years to kind of get to this point, which has been quite a long process in terms of standards development. Next slide, Riley. And just some of these kind of key steps, Steph alluded to that, just like meeting people, creating the possibility of developing a standard. And so we did that, but then we spent a year working and having workshops around Indigenous data sovereignty and standards, really trying to understand what can a standard do? How does it work within these spaces? I really want to give a shout out to Andy Russell, who really helped us kind of convene these workshops and think through the kind of strategic intervention that we would be making utilizing a standard. We also held an Indigenous metadata standards workshop in 2022, and then also produced Indigenous metadata communique publication, which was really based on all the people and the feedback, and then the community engagement that we did around what people want to see as metadata standards around Indigenous peoples data. Next slide. So this is just the Indigenous metadata bundle. We'll put the link to that in the chat there. But just to kind of see that the expectations around metadata really oscillated around questions of governance, questions of provenance, questions of like information and identification of lands and waters, questions around protocols, and also wanting to see local context labels and notices utilized more thoughtfully across different institutions. There were obviously other categories that came up, and we kind of list some of them, but these were really the kind of 5 areas that really rose to the top within our kind of workshops and consultations. Next slide. So if that was kind of like a little bit of the background of us getting to this point, Steph and I are just going to talk through some of the key provisions that you find in the standard. And next slide, Riley. So first of all, it is coming out through the Society of Social Implications of Technology. This was really where we kind of found a community in the Standards Association that understood what we were doing and actually supported the work all the way along. Next slide, Riley. And in the published standard, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in terms of we really worked hard to make it free and accessible to everybody rather than sitting behind a paywall. I just want to call out that, like, in the standard itself, all the names of the participants are there. But importantly, I want to draw attention to the Indigenous caucus that is actually named in this list and was a first for the IEEE. Camille, do you want to talk a little bit about the Indigenous caucus and how significant it was in this process?
Thank you, Jane. So my name is Camille Callison. I'm a member of the Tahltan Nation, and I'm currently residing on Semiahmoo lands here in what is known as White Rock, British Columbia. So I want to just really acknowledge all of the participants that were involved in the Indigenous caucus. It was a unique endeavor for IEEE to include as an additional kind of process through this working group that isn't standard and kind of is a model for how we would work with Indigenous people, where we really engaged with our Indigenous caucus all throughout the whole process, ensuring that we were doing our very best to be able to include Indigenous knowledge and protocols and our access protocols along the way as we did the work. And I think that that is a very significant part of watching this happen through mainstream. And really the central kind of point is that we want to point people back to Indigenous nations who are the holders of that knowledge, or the peoples that are the holders of the knowledge, to be able to advise on how we would work with their data and with their knowledge. So I think that that really sets out that practice firmly within the protocol and within the standard that we've developed. So thank you very much. And it was a long process, but I was really honored to be part of it.
Thanks, Camille. Jane, I also wanted to add that the standards making requirements for who's listed in the standard are pretty uh, descriptive and closed off. There were a lot more people who participated than or on this list because it was the list at the time of voting on the standard. So I do want to just shout out that acknowledgement to the broader group of people who participated in this. And I also want to say one of the things that we heard back from IEEE during the entire 5 year or so process of this is that we had a lot more people participating in the process than generally participate in standards making process there at IEEE in general. And so we're really proud of that and the interest that there was in contributing to this and how people stuck with it. So I know many people on this call were part of that too.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, because there were limitations in relationship to what the descriptive process of the IEEE. I mean, it's hard for anyone to stay part of a 5 year process, and so kind of really we really worked hard to get as much acknowledgement in here as possible. But we were also slightly bound by the framework of the standards organization that we were working with to start with. But so that's right, Steph. A huge shout out to everybody over the 5 years who came to work with us to create this standard. So next slide, Riley. So just to kind of briefly, and then it becomes really, we're going to become really technical. We really worked on this, what the scope of this recommended practice was going to be in terms of it details the process by which the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data should be described and recorded. It really outlines the core parameters for providing and digitally embedding the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data. And it really supports the appropriate disclosure of Indigenous peoples' relationships and or links to data, as well as the long-term identification of Indigenous peoples' data for future use, and connects data to people and place, and when appropriate, facilitates future benefit sharing. The purpose of the standard is really describing what provenance of Indigenous peoples' data includes, how the recommended practice should be operationalized, when, where, and how to disclose the provenance information and in what format, and then what the potential limitations exist for recognizing the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data. So really where we landed after all the work was that this standard is intended to really facilitate the interoperability of provenance fields among different information platforms and databases, and to support the disclosure and use of Indigenous peoples' data. I'm going to hand it back to you, Steph.
Thanks, Jane. I just put the link to the standard in the chat. Next slide, please, Riley. So we wanted to talk through a little bit of the core components of how we kind of push back at the IEEE system and included a lot of content that was important for kind of describing the operationalization of this standard. And so we did use an Indigenous data descriptor or definition in the terminology. So it's defined and then we further expound on it within the standard itself. We talk about Indigenous peoples data referring to any data, information, and knowledge recorded on any medium and in any format generated by Indigenous peoples, as well as by governments, the private sector, and other institutions or individuals that is on and about Indigenous peoples, their governments, or their more than human relations. Indigenous peoples data is comprised of, but not limited to, information, specimens, and knowledges about more than humans with which they have relations, information about Indigenous individuals, and information and knowledges about Indigenous peoples as collectives. So you hear some reference to how I described Indigenous data early on in this discussion. We also included some key terms like specimens, which has been something that many of us have been struggling with across the board in terms of getting access to and governance of, and really set forth this and push back against this notion of really defining Indigenous data as a really narrow scope in terms of interaction, but instead broadening it and keeping it broad so it can be defined by the community from which the data come. Next slide, please. And so we also listed out some examples of data, including writings like poetry, music, performances, ceremonies, artistic work, languages, oral traditions, and cultural narratives, documentation of our heritage in all forms of media, specimens, individual level socioeconomic data, and all health data related data and specimens, administrative data from various government sources and so forth, and environmental data. So this is not an inclusive list, but wanted to provide some examples where we have seen some conflict or efforts to take advantage of or to take without permission. Next slide, please. So we use the term data actor. This is a quote from Warinari from the podcast. When we say that there are data actors, we often interpret that as being a person, but the standards define data actors as a person, device, application, system, or organization that communicates, generates, uses, or stores information or data. Interestingly, this definition came from IEEE itself, so there was already other people using this terminology and being very broad. Next slide, please. So we set forth to define data actor within the scope here as a person, device, application, system, so forth, including research and research institutions, repositories and collections, data banks, aggregators, publishers, machines, algorithms, other sensor, observation and artificial intelligence technology, and data scrapers. So the definition of data actor really applies equally across public, private, governmental, administrative, commercial, and non-commercial actors. One of the most fundamental important things that the standard does is then it defines these data actors, it defines non-human data actors, and then it says that people are responsible for the non-human data actors. And so no longer can you say that it was a machine that did this, or we couldn't control what was going on with it. Whoever has generated and controls that machine, that data scraper, and so forth, is responsible for recording provenance and maintaining provenance. Next slide, please. And finally, a note on disclosure of Indigenous peoples' relationships and links to data. We talk through how data should be disclosed whenever a data actor is made aware of or becomes aware that Indigenous peoples are in relationships and are linked to the data that they are using. So they need to be consulted and their approval obtained before the tangible object, material resource, or the intangible knowledges, information, language, or culture is first collected or accessed. So this should include discussions with Indigenous peoples about what is being accessed or collected, how it is to be described, whether there are any restrictions on subsequent use, including any derived data, and the relevant Indigenous data provenance information to be disclosed with the data. And so clear pathway there of responsibility, and also note the reference to both tangible and intangible items and knowledges that can become data. Next slide, please. So at this point, we're going to shift a little bit more and talk through some of the process and how this was within the parameters of how IEEE creates a standard, and then how we adapted and also inserted certain elements like the Indigenous caucus into the process. This started at the very beginning. IEEE requires you to hold your meetings using Robert's Rules of Order. The first thing we encountered before we had the first meeting was we said we would like to give an acknowledgement at the start of the meeting before we head into anything else. And we had to really work to get that to be accepted as a part of the meeting process, to not only acknowledge lands, but to acknowledge why we were there and what we were doing and the importance of that, and to keep that relational in the process. And so it really began from the start. This kind of, I wouldn't say fight, but really paying particular attention to the process that we were going through. Next slide, please.
And Steph, I'll just add before we go any further that the thanks to Desi for asking us this question. The IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and it's an American 501(c)(3) professional organization for electrical engineering, electronics engineering, and related disciplines. And why this standards organization was partly because we saw the opportunity to really build into how people are building future technology that have to think about Indigenous provenance as they're building and as they're developing. And this was kind of really the place that we thought that this standard would be particularly effective. And so that's kind of why IEEE rather than any other, rather than ISO, for example, but really kind of seeing who the users of this standard would be and how much that would actually impact the technology that's being developed and influence a much better practice around Indigenous data sovereignty.
Yeah, thanks, Desi, for that question. Because I think the other important pieces around that is like it is how do you foresee and leverage what the opportunity is? Going through the International Standards Organization is a very government-bound, nation-state-bound process that could take even longer than this 5.5 years it took us to get this standard out there. And then one of the other things I think that most people don't understand is the IEEE, while it's electronics and electrical engineering, we don't really recognize how much those fields impact our everyday life. And so Jane kind of alluded to it with the technology speak, but it's across the board. So you will see these standards applied within, for instance, transportation, healthcare, and so forth. And so it really has this broad applicability. It is very strongly related to the technology advances that are going on, and it allowed us to only take 5.5 years, which seemed like a lifetime, but it moved a lot faster than some other processes. Um, okay, is Maui here?
No.
No. All right. So, Camille, I don't know if you want to hop on or Randy Akee want to talk about this a little bit, but all through this process, we were forefronting Indigenous participation and leadership at all stages in ways that the IEEE had never seen or done before. And so the IEEE process is standardized and rigorous. Think of engineers, so even more so than some other disciplines might have been. It's very much oriented towards individuals as expert contributors and representatives of professional communities. So many of the participants in other standards making processes are professionals or from universities and so forth. We forefronted the values of relationality, respect, and reciprocity, and figured out ways to weave them into the process that we were doing. And as I described from the start, we wanted to ensure that input and connection with Indigenous professionals and Indigenous communities was there. And so this required additional communication, aligned process steps, and so forth. And so we had, if you see in this model, I'm going to shout out to Maui Hudson who made this model, although he's not here with us to explain it to you. We went through a process of having an Indigenous chair for the working group, and then a non-Indigenous ally as a vice chair. That was myself and Jane. Indigenous expert participation through the caucus, but also through our regular meetings. We had subgroups to the working group, and all of those were paired like we had paired for the um, for the main working group that created the standard, and that we had an Indigenous lead and then a co-lead. We had our Indigenous caucus meetings that Maui Hudson and Camille Callison led. And then we went through a formal Indigenous consultation process in 2023 that myself, Jane, oh, here's Maui, Maui Hudson, um, and led through that process to gain feedback from across the globe. And we had participation broadly from across the globe in that. And that feedback that we got through consultation was very limited feedback on the standard itself. And more feedback on the framing of the standard so that we were telling the story adequately of how we gotten to the point that we needed to create the standard, basically, and what the purpose of the standard was. Anyone have anything to add to this?
I think if Maui's here, he might be able to speak to it as well.
I think he hopped on.
Hi, everybody. I'm Randy Akee. I'm here on Tongva land, Gabrielino land in Los Angeles. I'm He Hawaii no Ho'io no Oahu Maio. I'm Hawaiian from Hawaii. But I just wanted to also sort of reiterate why we went with IEEE. It's a really well-known international organization for standards on, as Stephanie and Jane were mentioning, and really highly recognized in all different fields for setting standards. So it really was intended for us to be able to create a provenance standard here that was well regarded, well respected, and seen as the good housekeeping seal of approval that we had gone through, that is again recognized by other organizations, but also internationally. So it really was a really, there were other ways of going, but this really was sort of part of the reason, and they really did work with us. And I'll stop now and let Camille talk about the really innovative component that we were all very proud of to participate with and specifically the fact that there was an Indigenous caucus that was sort of parallel and interactive with the main thrust of the work that we all did. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Randy. I think it's really important to recognize that Indigenous people have always really actively stewarded our own knowledge, both tangible and intangible knowledge as it relates to our culture, lands, humans, and non-human relatives. And I think one of the challenging parts of this was that not all the protocols are going to be the same, and not all the types of knowledge that we want to be able to some is public access, and so those are things that we openly share. But it's also really important that some of the ways that we share it has to be done in a culturally appropriate way. And so that was one of the real challenges that came up often and on a regular basis throughout the Indigenous caucus, is how do we make it both generic and specific enough so that it actually is meaningful, but it also allows for a variety of Indigenous peoples and protocols and the way that they work with their knowledge really globally. And how do we make it so that that it can be applicable? And I think that that is one of the challenges without getting too granular. And so we would have to pull ourselves back quite often from the granular way that we might do it in our community versus how other people would do it in theirs. And I think that was very much at play. And the people in the Indigenous caucus were just very amazed at the contributions from not only our we had the subgroups, but we all and those leaders, but also to the engagement from across the board through the IEEE process, and really their support to be able to do that. And I think that is one of the things that was really challenging throughout this process, is to be able to integrate all of that and make sure that we were still creating something that would be vibrant but living or evergreen, that could be added to. Really, it's the base of where people would want to go from this. So I look at it as a base standard that people would build on within their own communities and be able to take and use and adapt to their protocols and to the way that they interact with their tangible and intangible knowledges. And I think that's been it actually felt like it was really I learned a lot through the process, and I'm sure others did, but it also was just a valuable process in seeing how we could make something that could be taken and used by communities in a good way to be able to work better with others that are using that data and ensure that the provenance is noted in all areas along the way. So I want to raise my hands to all of you from that worked on this and that contributed to it and that were consulted in it. And thank you so much for your time, Madhu and Teltan. Really appreciate the communication, and I really believe it's a beginning of a lot, hopefully more of a movement to go towards us working together globally to create this change.
And Stephanie and Jane, I don't think you guys have mentioned it, or Camille either. The sheer number of people from various parts of the globe that were involved in this. So as for the rest of you, just coordinating a Zoom call during the middle of the pandemic, number one. But on top of that, just the different time zones, but it was deemed necessary for us to do it so that we got input from Indigenous peoples from essentially all over the globe. But Stephanie, do you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, sure. So we had broad participation both in the standard making process of the working group and during the consultation phases. And I think one of the things that stood out is when we would go to the broader IEEE Standards Association meetings, people were always flabbergasted that we could get so many people to our meetings. How did you pick a time that it was across the globe? I started thinking in UTC time, essentially, in order, but we made sacrifices in terms of the times that we met in order to facilitate that. And we also, had some offline availability, especially when we were in the consultation process, to allow people who to look at the standard, which was outside the realm of how IEEE definitely runs generally. So we shared that standard broadly with registrants for the consultation process so they could read through it and participate in the editing of it. I just want to give two nods, and then I think we can go to some broader conversation here. One is that we had four subgroups, one around conceptual issues that looked at, as you can tell, the conceptual issues around a standard for provenance, another around the scope and purpose. And so that was back to the kind of the heart of why we did this. And then looking at the standards landscape of related standards so that we were kind of situating ourselves and making sense in that place. And then finally drafting. Next slide, please. This is from our consultation process, as I said, in 23. You can see some of our speakers there as the same as we look now, thankfully. Next slide, please. I'm just going to close and then I'm going to give a couple links. If Andrew, if you can put the link for the standard in again, you can get that for free. I think the main strategies we used for advancing IEEE and the standard through IEEE was prioritizing Indigenous peoples, really looking for Indigenous leadership and finding our allies to support that. Moving through the Indigenous caucus, I saw a question from Jackie in the chat about whether or not the caucus still exists. The concept still exists. It was a caucus to our working group there. IEEE has indicated interest in maintaining some sort of caucus format moving forward, and we haven't discussed with them what that might look like, essentially because for the vast majority of us working on this, though it might be related to our everyday job, this was a volunteer situation. And so there was a lot of work that was done outside of it. We went through that consultation process, and then finally, we were committed from the start to open access and source for this standard. So this is available through the IEEE, what's called GET program. If you go to the link to the standard towards the left side of the page is the link to log in. You need to create a login to download it for free. We have paid for 1 year of open access through some two grants that Max Libron and myself lead through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So we are looking for future funding to maintain that open access, but really working hard to make sure that we can have that. And maybe I'll pitch it to Camille or somebody to talk about why we wanted it open access um, and the importance of that.
Well, I think that many on the call may know, but some may not, that many of the standards are behind a paywall, and so people pay for subscriptions to be able to download those standards. So they aren't free and open access for the general public to be able to access. And communities, Indigenous communities around the world don't have that kind of funding to be able to pay for a membership to be able to do that. And since it's really been a standard that's been created by Indigenous people for Indigenous people and Indigenous people and our allies. I don't want to forget our allies because we had incredible engagement and really appreciate the expertise that came alongside to be able to help us with this endeavor. But if we can't actually allow Indigenous people to download a standard that they've created, then volunteering their time to be able to do that, then it didn't seem to obviously be not only fair, but also beneficial for communities. And the idea is for communities to take and activate this and to implement it as part of what they would like to do. And so because of that, we really were passionate about being able to provide it open access. And it is challenging because it is obviously not part of the business model to be able to do that for IEEE, but they were very willing to be able to look at how we can work with them and really appreciative to the funding that came through to be able to allow this to happen. And I think that that will continue to be one of the challenges in keeping this open so that people are able to access it, and it still remains a standard that's an IEEE standard. So hopefully we'll be able to find sponsorship to be able to continue that. But it is critical that we have access to this in our community so that we can implement it and say, you know, this is where we want to start from. And I know that I saw a question earlier in the chat about how do we make it retroactive? Well, I think that that really is something in the implementation when communities are working with others that have access to their data or maybe hold their data, that they need to go and say, you know what, this is a standard, this has been worked on, and we would like to be able to implement it in the work that's already happened, because that is our knowledge that you're holding, whether it's tangible or intangible knowledge that you are holding in your repositories, whether it's from a research grant or a library, archive, or museum or other type of repository. We want to have that ability to be able to put our protocols in place. And that really is important because it is the way of us culturally sharing our knowledge in a way that's culturally appropriate. So when we're sharing that, we want to be able to integrate other aspects to it because our knowledge is holistic and it doesn't just exist in a little teeny cell of on a database that's that exists on its own as a standalone. It's really connected to other knowledges and other forms. So it's really an intangible web of that knowledge that is about that. And if you don't have the other knowledge that's around it, you don't have a full understanding of what that knowledge is. So I think that those things are where our communities can go and activate this and say, this is here, we'd like to implement it, and we'd like your support in doing this. And now it's a global standard. And so to me, it's about empowering Indigenous communities to be able to continue to be custodians of their own knowledge and to steward their own knowledge into the future, especially as we see things like AI and other things starting to develop. It's even more critical now than it was when we started this even 5 and 6 years ago. So I think that that's really important that we maintain that open access, and move forward in a good way.
Thank you, Camille. At this point, I just wanted to open up to comment to Randy or Jane or Maui if you have points you wanted to touch back on, especially seeing some of the questions in the chat.
Great. I think there was a question of where we go with the data standards and what the next one is. So, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I'd actually love to hear what others think about it. My sense is that this was a lot of work to get this one going. I'd love to see this really sort of put into practice and sort of the knowledge of how this works and what data provenance means interoperably. I think there's a lot of scope for future ones, future standards, and I think they're probably within like disciplinarily specific data types, maybe science, social sciences, and humanities and the arts even. But I think for me, I'd love to see us be able to really expand on that. So I'll stop there.
Builder. If I can just kick into Maui Hudson from Whakatoa, the Whakatoa Nation on the lands of the Waikato Tainui. Yeah, look, it was a great process, and I just saw the comment about the tyranny of the time zones and how we managed to get like quite a good representation. I think in some ways it's because of essentially the pent-up demand. We've been dealing with, these challenges, right around the world in different ways. And so I think this first one was able to kind of tap into the needs that people felt generally that something needed to be done. And we got, really great commitment and participation from, a wider variety of people to get this first one up and running. I do think it is a first one. I think it was the right one to start with, thinking about provenance. Because it is the one that helps to create more visibility within the system or across different systems. And so as that starts to kind of move along and build up, there's going to be other ones that kind of naturally rise up. I don't think we've kind of discussed exactly what that is at the moment, but I think there'll be a bit of time trying to see how this standard can start to be implemented in different places, and then we'll get to the next logical place the next logical standard to put in place.
Yeah, so I'll just add just a couple of extra things. So it was only finally adopted in November last year. So we are really new in this space in terms of having the standard. So there are lots of questions in the chat about how can communities use this. I think both Camille and Steph have talked a little bit about that. Will it be used retroactively? We were absolutely thinking about retroactive use, knowing how much data is already out there that doesn't have provenance information connected to it. So we were thinking about that as we were writing it. So it does have components in there that speak to that. And we were also thinking across multiple disciplines, not only the kind of archive, museums, heritage sector, but genomic sciences, biodiversity, soil sciences, everywhere where there's kind of data coming out of Indigenous lands and waters was incorporated into the thinking that we had around this particular standard. So what it's going to look like as different kinds of, communities and other kind of technology entities integrated, we don't know yet. Our work was to get it done. And so kind of we're in this space at the moment. We would love to hear what you guys might think for future standards. We always thought that there would be a family of standards, with the provenance piece being kind of this key first piece because it opens up so much. So we'd love to hear about that. And I'll just throw it back to you, Steph. I know that we're really close. I guess one this was kind of hard work, and I just wondered if the panel had any kind of thoughts about what they thought was the hardest piece. I'll start by saying keeping alive something for 5 years was really, really hard, and turning up and being consistent and making sure that we were on it and actually as inclusive as we could possibly be for 5 years was really, really hard. So I'll hand it to you, Steph. I know you have thoughts around what was hard as well.
It was definitely hard to keep the momentum. And thanks to many, many people, especially you and Randy, for kind of in the end when it was a flight of that, sticking it through. And I think, I am going to shift a little bit kind to as we wrap up, to say a couple things. One is, what can you do with this standard? And so I think one of the things that we can all do with this standard is show it to our community leadership, show it to your institutional leadership, but mostly read the standard, understand it inside and out, and practice it every day. I was just talking to Riley, who's running the slides for us, and I were just on a call with a researcher before this meeting, and discussing the role of provenance. Really, Maui spoke to it eloquently, but the other piece of provenance is it keeps us and brings us home. Okay, so it tells you from where the data originate. And so, importantly, when we're talking about Indigenous peoples' data, we are talking about maintaining those relationships, and having that through line to home is utmost importance. And so, when you are working with data, how do you begin to record provenance adequately and appropriately? How do you promote others to do that? What systems need to be built? How do you build those into your infrastructure? How do you build them into your policy? How do you build them into your everyday practice? I think I'll shout out to Desi Small Rodriguez, who's on this call, who prompted me to make that statement. But also, when we began our work together over 10 years ago, one of the things that we were most trying to push is that everybody have some sort of knowledge and flexibility around what we're talking about, whether it be Indigenous data sovereignty or this provenance standard, and be able to be the one at the table who brings it up and says, hey, if we're collecting this data, how do we adequately and appropriately record provenance for the community when we're collecting this data? When we're creating policies in our communities, when we're creating policies at our universities, when we're creating policies at our governments, what role did this play? Where does it fit in? And how do we make sure it gets added? So I'm going to wrap up just on time here. Here's the QR code if you want to listen to the Relational Sciences podcast that kind of unpacks this standard a little bit more there for you all. I will give a shout out again to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada for supporting open access to it, to the National Science Foundation for supporting this webinar here. Huge Tanan, thank you to everybody who participated in this standard. And I want a really big party right now, but I'm alone in my office here. So someday we'll celebrate this in a way that is meant to be celebrated. Until then, be well, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Okay, we are done. Nice. All right. I'm gonna stop recording now. Good job, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew, for being on top of that.
Thank you all for your participation, comments in the chat. We've been collecting them. I did drop my email for folks that want to contact me directly. Tell your friends. We almost hit 500 registrations for this webinar. We were 8 short, which now my goal is to come back and hit 500 at some point, which would be pretty wild.